Hi, my name is Andy, and I'm 15 years old. Let me ask you a question. Do you love your siblings? For as long as I can remember, my older sister mocked me constantly and put me down. Because of her, I was afraid to live, and I mean that literally. One evening, when I was 10 and Judy, my sister, was 14, our parents asked her to babysit me. Although my sister hated me, recently with our parents, she'd been pretending to be a loving sister so that they would buy a car for her 16th birthday. When we were alone, she was always angry and made fun of me constantly. She would say that I was a wimp and a freak and that I was adopted. But that evening, everything went too far. As soon as my parents went away, Greg, Judy's boyfriend, came over. He was 17 and he was as nasty as my sister. Greg always called me a dweeb, making fun of my height and lack of muscles. When he and Judy got bored, they would force me to box with him or try to lift heavy dumbbells. I loved to draw comics and wanted only one thing, to be left alone. When Greg came over that night, they sat me down with them and put on a horror movie. In the film, monsters crawled out of people through their belly button and ripped them in half. I was terrified, but I was forced to sit and watch the awful film. Judy, seeing I was upset, laughed and grabbed my belly button. I have an outie belly button, and my sister told me that a monster, like from the film we were watching, lived in me. She claimed that she had seen a larva creep into my ear when I was younger, and soon a monster would burst out of my belly button and rip me apart. I couldn't sleep for a long time that night, and so I drew the monsters from the movie until I dozed off. In the morning, I woke up. Looking down, I saw blood. Red blood. It was like I had drawn last night. I lifted my pajama top, and there was blood around my belly button. I froze. I looked, and beneath the blood, there was something black. Just like the movie. I screamed so loud that all our neighbors heard me, and my mom came running into my room. I was hysterical and kept crying and trying to explain about the monster that was coming out of my belly button. I tried to tell my mom that I was going to die as soon as the thing burst out of me, and maybe I was adopted, but between the tears and the screaming, I didn't make any sense. Eventually, my mom lifted my pajama top, took one look at my belly button, and dragged me into the shower. I wasn't going to die. Judy and Greg had snuck into my room once I was asleep and drawn something that looked like a monster on my belly button, then covered it with ketchup. Judy got grounded, and I got sent to a child psychologist. I went to Stella, my psychologist, twice a week. Because of the incident with Judy and Greg and the movie, I developed an erratic phobia of belly buttons. As soon as I saw them, I would panic, thinking some monster would emerge and rip the person in twain. I had horrible nightmares and regularly awoke in a cold sweat. What was worse was that I started to notice something. My belly button really was getting bigger, and I was terrified. I didn't tell anyone, not Mom, not Dad, not even Stella. My belly button was getting bigger, and I knew what would happen once it got too big. The monster inside of me would come out and rip it apart. Eventually, the pain, which was only minor at first, got too bad. Desperate and thoroughly terrified, I told my mom. She took one look at my belly button and turned white. We were in an ambulance on the way to the hospital within the hour. At the hospital, the doctors discovered that I didn't have a case of the money bellies, but instead something called an umbilical hernia. Moreover, I had had this since birth. This umbilical hernia had had an effect on my growing up. It was the reason I was so weak, why I was so scrawny, why I was such a dweeb. I needed an operation to remove the hernia and was put under for it. But when I came to, I made a startling discovery. I no longer had a belly button. It had been removed alongside my hernia. The thing I was most afraid of was gone. But despite this, I still had nightmares and still felt uneasy about the whole thing. Judy, annoyed at having gotten in trouble, continued to tease me. She constantly told me that the monster was still inside me and hadn't been removed and was going to crawl out any day now. I'd had surgery to remove a hernia, and my outie had been removed as well. So why did this bother me? Because I could feel something moving in my stomach. This time, I told Stella right away, but she thought it was my phobia playing on my perception of her. She was proven wrong very quickly, as a few days after our session, I came down with a fever. It got worse and worse, and eventually my mom called an ambulance. I was taken back to the hospital, but I was terrified. Were the doctors going to find the monster in my stomach? Was I going to be torn apart? Not quite, but the doctors did find something. During my operation, a piece of cotton wool had broken off inside of me, which none of the doctors had spotted. This wool had been resting inside of me, absorbing liquid and moving about. Because it was near where I had had the surgery, the skin was tender, and thus I felt a lot of pain when it brushed the tissue. Now I had an even uglier scar, as the doctors had to remove it too. I was never vain or proud of my body, but now I was extraordinarily self-conscious about it. My parents spent a lot of time with me, and Judy grew ever more jealous. She was angry at me too, as apparently I had stopped Mom and Dad from buying her a car at 16. In fact, Mom and Dad had seen how she behaved towards me when she thought they weren't looking, and decided she wasn't mature enough for a car. She continued to mock me, to tease me, and to tell me I was adopted. Mom and Dad finally had enough and decided to arrange a very special birthday party for me. On my 12th birthday, my parents arranged for only a small celebration. No friends, no relative, just me, Mom, Dad, and Judy. Mom and Dad told us they had something to tell me, and Dad showed me an old piece of paper. It was an adoption certificate. Judy had been right all along. I was adopted. I had been adopted when I was a few months old, Mom told me. They showered me in kind words and told me how much they loved me, whilst Judy stood there, her face full of malice and glee. That was until Dad presented a second old piece of paper. Judy, we adopted you too. You and Andrew are biological siblings. We love you both equally. The truth was, our parents couldn't have children. They had decided to adopt a baby from an orphanage, that is, me. But they learned that I had an older sister and didn't want to separate us, so they took us both in. Our biological parents had died in a car accident 3 months after my birth. For so many years, we had thought each other different and weird and had vied with each other for our parents' love, when in fact, we were the same. 2 orphan children adopted by parents who loved us both equally. I struggled with my phobia for years. I sometimes thought that I would never get past it. But a few days after my birthday, it just vanished. I don't know how to explain it. It just stopped being a problem. Judy changed too. Since learning that we were both adopted, we get on better. She is more supportive and nice, and I try to help her any way I can. Do you remember I used to draw cartoons? Well, I still do, except now I get paid for it. I developed my love for comics and monsters into a job as a freelance artist and illustrator. I draw monsters for a living, and my belly button? Well, let's just say I make far scarier monsters now. This is what happens in life. Our greatest fears can develop into our greatest triumphs, and almost enemies become our dearest friends. Is there anything that you're terrified of? Share it with us in the comments below, and remember to like and subscribe to our channel.